Now, just to catch up where we left Saul, remember Samuel has anointed him. God told him that he was to anoint the king, and Saul sticks out. He looks like a king, and this is one thing the writer wants us to see, is everybody likes the idea of Saul being the king because he looks like a king. He's a head taller than everybody else in Israel. He's very, very handsome, and he looks like a hard worker. So he's anointed king. Samuel goes through this entire demonstration of having each tribe pass and then each clan. The lot falls on each one of them, finally on the family of Kish. And he says, okay, where's Saul? And Saul's hiding among the baggage. They pull him out and anoint him as king. The humility that Saul shows at the beginning of his ministry is very different than what we're going to see in today's lesson. He doesn't stay humble like that. So after Saul is anointed as king, he does something very unkingly like. He goes home. He goes back to the farm. And he's pretty much not doing anything until there's a crisis. And it says in the end of chapter 10, verse 26, I believe that is, Saul also went to his home at Gibeah, and with him went men of valor whose hearts God had touched. But some worthless fellow said, "How can this man save us?" And they despised him and brought him no present. But he held his peace. So you've got, Israel is divided. Some people are still not accustomed to the idea of a king. Saul has been anointed. His valiant men go home with him, but they go home to farm. He doesn't know, what does a king do? There's no palace. There's no central city. Remember, David is the guy who's going to choose Jerusalem as the site of the capital. And right now, the ark and the tabernacle set up in northern Israel at Shiloh, and Saul's from the tribe of Benjamin, which is in the south, right by Judah. So, everybody goes back. We don't know how to be a king. We don't know how to follow a king. Well, crisis will always remind us of our need of government. We don't like government. We don't like kings until crisis comes, and then we go, man, the government needs to do something about this. Now, it's bad when the government is the one creating the crisis. That happens too in a lot of, throughout all history. But here they have a crisis, and it's that the Philistines who live among them cause trouble. Verse 1 of chapter 11, Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a treaty with us and we'll serve you." Now let me sort of shorten this and tell you, here's the deal. And this is what a lot of treaties in the ancient world look like. So Nahash, this Ammonite, so Ammon would be sort of on the other side of the Dead Sea, over there where Moab is, and he's come across the Jordan River, and he's attacked, and he's pretty much besieged this town. The men of the town say, "Look, tell us what we got to do. We'll make a treaty with you." In other words, basically, this is usually you make an agreement to give them a certain percentage of your crops, supply so many slaves, this kind of thing. And the Ammonites say, "Okay, we'll make a treaty with you, but as part of the treaty, we're going to gouge out your eyes." And because this is a shameful thing, to gouge out eyes is a terribly shameful thing. And by the way, that's still being done. I saw recently a documentary about mass murder taking place in different parts of our world, and that is still done as just a very barbaric way to inflict pain and humiliation on people, even the people you're going to kill anyway. And so they say, we're going to gouge out your eyes. And this is sort of strange the way they have this gentlemanly discussion about whether or not they're going to let their eyes get gouged out. But they go, okay, well, give us 7 days to think about it. And 7 days to try and see if anybody else in Israel will come to our rescue. And the Ammonites go, okay. Now that sort of seems strange to me, that they don't go, no, you decide right now. If you don't decide right now, we're going to attack. Why would you allow them time to try and muster other troops? But they do. And so they send out word, and this word is met with a little bit of indifference, ennui, and insouciance by many of the Israelites. But when Saul hears it, the mantle of leadership has come on Saul. Look down at verse 6. The Spirit of chapter 11, the Spirit of God rushed upon Saul when he heard these words, and his anger was greatly kindled. Now again, I wanted to point out to you that the Spirit of God coming on Saul is always shown as episodic and temporary, right? This is not a guy who's filled with the Spirit all the time, walking around, and as a person filled with the Spirit, he operates in life. That's not who Saul is. The Spirit comes upon him to prophesy, and then he stops prophesying. The Spirit comes upon him here to be angry and to deal with this problem. And later we're going to see God not only takes his spirit from him, he sends an evil spirit upon him. So you see Saul as very much a man who is operated on by external forces. The point being that he's really not even his own guy. So he hears this, the Spirit of God comes upon him, and he's angry. He took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout all the territory. Now, why is this significant? Anybody have any idea? Why would it be significant to cut up oxen? It is your livelihood, right? It's like, okay, there's no going back. What he's saying is the work of the year is done. You know, all that long list of stuff I had to do on the farm, it's gone. There's only a list of one thing now, and it's to get them back. I've cut up my oxen. Here, I'm sending this to you to show you I'm in. Your new king is in, so I need you to do likewise. Now, where have we seen something similar to this? Unfortunately, Judges 19, when the concubine is raped to death, the Levite, her sort of husband, chops her up in all these pieces and sends her bodies to the 12 tribes. What's the difference? Well, A, she's human, and B, that's not a sacrifice he made. It's one that was sort of made by someone else. So it's not the same thing. It does say a lot about the way the Levite treated her. And so we know from these scenes that this was a way that they communicated dire circumstances. Things are so bad, we're burning our tractors. Things are so bad, we're leaving our crops to take care of this. Here's the evidence that I'm going to lead in this. And when, a messenger comes with a piece of Saul's ox and says the king has cut up his oxen and says he's going after the Ammonites, we need you to do the same. It's not like just sending a message saying, okay, we're taking a poll, how many of you would come if? Saul is saying he's all in. And look at this. Whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. You're going to lose your oxen one way or the other. If you don't come voluntarily, we're going to invoke a law of conscription. You will pay. Then the dread of the Lord fell upon the people, and they came out as one man. When he mustered them at Bezek, the people of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. So there were 300,000 Israelites. 30,000 of them were from Judah, and so that shows that they're carrying their weight. And they said to the messengers who'd come, Thus shall you say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, you shall have salvation. Now, can you imagine if you're one of these guys in Jabesh Gilead and you've been given a sentence on a certain day, your eyes are going to be gouged out and you'll become a slave and you're going to lose everything. The only thing you'll have is your unsighted life. And suddenly word comes, there are 300,000 men coming to rescue you. Boy, that had to feel good. Respite on the way. The rescue is coming. And so now these guys, now for the first time, they're a little bit strategic. So the men of Jabesh said to the Ammonites, tomorrow we'll give ourselves up to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you. So they trust the word of Saul so much that they say, hey, tomorrow you can just have your way with us. It's our last day. And again, it makes no sense to me that an army that is so willing to gouge their eyes out and put them to death and enslave them would give them this kind of time. Mistake that they made, and they did. The men of Jabesh said tomorrow, the Ammonites accepted that. But verse 11, the next day Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And those who survived there scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. So for about 2 hours, Saul in 3 companies comes down on the camp and he just wipes them out. So at least 50% of them are taken. Nobody has his partner left at the end of this battle. And then this has solidified Saul's leadership credibility. The people said to Samuel, who is it that said, shall Saul reign over us? Remember those worthless fellows back up in verse 27 of chapter 10? Well, now they're saying, hey, bring those guys out. We want to deal with them. Bring them in that we may put them to death. But Saul said, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel. Again, see the humility of Saul? These guys are now wanting to pounce on those worthless fellows that said, who's this guy anyway? What makes him king? And Saul could take advantage of the heat of this political moment and work at his advantage and eradicate his enemies, but he does not. He says, no, the Lord gave us this victory. We're not going to celebrate the Lord's victory by killing people that are our brothers. And he says, you leave them alone. And Samuel said to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingdom. So all the people went to Gilgal, and they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they sacrificed peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So now, the end of chapter 11, you have this picture of a united kingdom. Saul has solidified his reign. He's humble and he's victorious. So far, so good. Now, chapter 12 begins Samuel's farewell address. Now, I find this almost comic because Samuel gives a farewell address at least 3 times in 1 Samuel. 3 times he goes, now, the time has come for me to depart, and it's a lovely speech. And he basically says to them, now look, I've obeyed the voice of the Lord before you. Now you've made a king. The king walks before you. I'm old and gray. My sons are with you. He sort of leaves out the detail that his sons are worthless. But he says, I've walked before you from my youth until this day. And whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I defrauded? Much like I have said in our 2 Corinthians study, man, when you've lived a life of faithfulness, people accuse you and say crazy stuff about you. When you've got a track record And you can just go, okay, where has that ever happened? You know, every now and then, just because, I don't know, we're just in a crazy age where people just feel like, A, their opinion matters, and B, it's right. And they just put up crazy stuff. And, you know, I've had in the last year crazy videos put up against me, blogs written against me, and, you know, all this kind of just crazy stuff. That you look at 41 years of ministry, there's not one hint of that being true in it. And so I just go, you know, if anybody's dumb enough to believe it when there's nothing in my ministry about that, you know, if I'm liberal, I'm the best liar you've ever met in your whole life. I've lied consistently about that and you know, pretended to be a conservative for all these years. Yet somebody out there, you know, says, oh, you're a liberal or you're this or that. Look, Samuel here says, okay, if I've defrauded you, speak up. Whose donkey have I taken? Whose ox have I taken? Where is any evidence that I have not been faithful to the Lord as I have ministered to you? Whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me, and I'll restore it to you. And they said, you have not defrauded or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand. Now, that's a great testimony, isn't it? To get to the end of one's life and ministry and say, okay, I'm just throwing the floor open. If I've wronged you, speak up. I want to make it right. And the universal testimony is, you've not wronged us. He says, all right, the Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day that you've not found anything in my hand. They said, he is witness. So this is Samuel's way of saying, I'm ready for my life to end. I've been faithful. Your testimony is to my faithfulness, and I'm ready to go. And Samuel said to the people, the Lord is witness who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your fathers up out of the land of Egypt. Now therefore stand still, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous deeds of the Lord that he performed for you and for your fathers. And so he rehearses to them their history, and in it, it's got two main themes. Here's what God did for you, and here's the faithless way you responded. God brought your fathers up out of Egypt, verse 9. But they forgot the Lord their God, and he sold them into the hand of Sisera. And verse 10, they cried out to the Lord, said, we've sinned. And so the Lord sent Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, and Barak, and Jephthah, and Samuel, and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side. But when Nahash came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord your God was your king. And he says, now the king whom you've chosen, for whom you've asked, behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. What's the key there? It's a big if. If you and the king will both follow the Lord, everything will be okay. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. Now, therefore, stand still and see this great thing that the Lord will do before your eyes. Is not wheat harvest today? I'll call upon the name of the Lord that he may send thunder and rain, and you shall know and see that your wickedness is great. Now, boy, if there's a day you don't want rain, it's the day you're harvesting your wheat. You need it to be dry. And this is not the rainy season. This is the dry season. Samuel's just saying, okay, just to show you how displeased with you the Lord is, I'm going to make your harvest a little difficult. I'm calling on the Lord to send thunder and rain to show you your wickedness. And boy, the Lord did it, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. And the people said to Samuel, "Pray for your servants to the Lord your God that we may not die." Now look at how they've changed their tune. "For we have added to all our sins this evil, to ask for ourselves a king." You think Saul is feeling a little awkward at this point? I mean, he stands there as the evidence of their sin. But the Lord has basically said, all right, I'm going to give you what you want. And there's a way that this can go well. If all of you will follow me and your king will follow me, this can turn out okay, even though this was not my will. But of course, we know it does not. Samuel gives the promise in verse 22, the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. And you can't lose sight of that God has no reason, let me say no earthly reason, to make the Jews, the descendants of Abraham, his chosen people. Why would he do that? And God says it several times in the Old Testament. He says, I didn't choose you because you were the greatest. You're not. You're small. There's nothing in you that would make me choose you. I didn't see anything in you that would make me say, oh, I want them. I think a lot of times when we pray for people that are lost, a lot of times we meet people who are gifted and talented and maybe wealthy, and we say, boy, if we could reach them, our church could really use a couple like that. You ever find yourself thinking in those terms? No, there's some truth in that, and I understand that. But the reality is, God's not needy. He doesn't need them. And God loves the addict as much as he does the CEO. He has to do a work of grace in each of them. He doesn't need anything they've got. He doesn't need their intellect. And this is God's testimony to Israel. I chose you. You didn't choose me. You needed me. I didn't need you. And it pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. He's made you different from all the other peoples of the world, but you weren't originally. You weren't inherently. And so Samuel says, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. And I will instruct you in the good and right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. For consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king. So, Samuel warns them, and he says, I'm going to pray for you. But this is one of several farewell addresses that he gives on some level. And so a year goes by after this event, and Saul sort of becomes known as the king, solidifies his reign. And when he had reigned 2 years, he chose 3,000 men of Israel, and they were with him in the hill country of Michmash and the hill country of Bethel. 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. So Saul is in the more northern part of the country, in the hill country up there, known as the range of Carmel and Gilboa. And Jonathan is down in the southern part, near the tribes of Benjamin and Judah. And the Philistines hear of it. If you look at a map of Israel, you'll see, especially Israel in the Old Testament, you'll see Philistine cities all over the place. If you've ever been to Israel with me, one of the main big archaeological digs we go to, in fact, it's the largest archaeological site in Israel, is called Bet Shan. And though when we walk in Bet Shan, what you see is the Roman and Byzantine levels that are being excavated. There's a hill behind it, and a few of us climbed up that hill. Tanya climbed up that hill a few times. I've climbed up it once, and up on that hill, they filmed part of the movie Jesus Christ Superstar, the Temptation scene is up there. Confrontation between Judas and Jesus is up on a hill. And there's still a tree up there that they brought up there. It's a total prop, and it stands on that hill. Well, that hill was the Philistine city of Bethshan. And so it's an ancient city. It's got centuries of levels. And the reason is there's so many earthquakes. I mean, so some civilization will build a city, an earthquake will come, will wipe it out. The next civilization comes along, takes the materials that they find laying over on their sides and stuff, rearranges them and puts their own stamp on them and builds a city. And usually, the higher you go to the top, the more recent, your older stuff is at the bottom. The exception to that rule is that at Bethshan, we're up on the hill is where the Philistines were. The Romans and the Byzantines were down in this valley. But the Romans didn't need to protect Bethshan. It was just a stop on a trade route. The Philistines had to have it up on that hill because now they're surrounded by Israelites, right? And they need to see them coming. So right there to their east, you've got the Jordan Valley. So they're up above it, and they can see anybody coming from Moab, and Ammon has to cross the Jordan River. They can see where they cross, and they can see all as far as to the range of the Gilboa. Toward the north, they can see the Carmel, Megiddo, all of that right there from on that hill. And so the Philistines, they occupy these high places. And not only do you have military outposts at high places, what else do you have? Altars. So you got all these pagan altars. You read in the Old Testament all about the high places. And these later kings, it will say of them, well, they did such and such and such and such, but they did not destroy the high places. And it's these altars that have been left around the country. So the Philistines are able to see the movements of troops. They see Saul in the north and Jonathan, his son, in the south, and the fact that they have troops. They make a move. Verse 3, Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. So the word spreads to all the other Philistine towns. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. So this is if you go to Israel today, you can buy these shofars, these big ram's horns. And that's what they would use. They would blow the shofar, this ram's horn, and the next guy up the road would hear it, and he would blow it. And so you have this whole system of alarm sounding throughout the nation saying, hey, come and assemble. This is the draft. And they're telling everybody to come and fight a battle. And he said, let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard it, said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become a stench to the Philistines, and the people were called out to join Saul at Gilgal. And the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and troops, like the sand on the seashore in multitude. Now, what the author's telling us here is that the Philistines are well equipped for war. They're warrior people. They've got chariots, horses. They've been doing this a long time. They're from Phoenicia, right? So they're settlers from Phoenicia to the north that have come down, and they brought all this fine military equipment with them. Not only that, we know they're blacksmiths. They work with iron. So here you're seeing right before you basically an overlap of a Stone Age and an Iron Age. The Israelites are still like in the Stone Age. Their tools are made out of rocks. Not so with the Philistines. These guys know how to make stuff, out of iron. And so they come up when the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and holes and rocks and tombs and cisterns. and some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead, Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. And there people are afraid. Okay, we got one battle, and this stirred up the Philistines like a nest of hornets, and now we're about to get stung. We swatted one down and thought we did great, but now they're all ticked at us. And so Saul said, verse 9, bring the burnt offering here to me. He waits 7 days, time appointed, 7 days, and they're waiting to attack, but they need what? Well, they need Saul, the prophet, to show up. They need Saul to offer the sacrifice so they can then attack. They want the Lord's blessing. But nothing happens. 7 days are going by, and your enemy is just getting stronger, and you're risking every day that they're going to attack. So Saul said, bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. All right, now you got to get this. Saul, everybody knows, Samuel's the man of God. Samuel's supposed to do this. Saul gets impatient and bring it here. I'll do it. He offers it. Now, part of me sympathizes with Saul here. One thing, who has patience to wait 7 days for something? And, okay, we're waiting, and there really is a military desperation here. And Saul, the Holy Spirit had come on Saul to prophesy. So he's been a prophet, he's a king. Why can't he be priest too? And it's reasonable, it's just not right. Those are the things that get us in trouble, aren't they? The things that seem reasonable at the moment, but they're just not right. And as soon as he offers the sacrifice, Samuel shows up. Verse 11, verse 10, Saul sees Samuel coming. He goes out to meet him. He's like, let's get away from the smell of the burning flesh here. And Samuel says, what have you done? And Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattering from me, that you did not come within the days appointed, that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Look at that. I forced myself. I didn't want to do it, but I did what had to be done. There's his argument. And Samuel said to Saul, you've done foolishly. You've not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you, for then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. Now the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you've not kept what the Lord commanded you. Now this is interesting to me because at this point in the record, I don't think there's a word that God has spoken to Samuel to say this. He's not yet told Samuel there's going to be another king. And as I told you, my view is that Samuel is always very loyal to Saul. I think he loves Saul. He's obedient to the Lord with regard to David. They hide out together, you're going to see, but it's always strained, it seems to me, between Samuel and David. Samuel and Saul go way back. They're intimate, but Samuel is frustrated with Saul because he's always doing stuff like this. And here he tells him, I don't know, has the Lord told him this, or does he simply know the Lord's character so much? And God's promise has already been given that if Israel or the king doesn't follow after his commands, he's going to be done with them. And is that enough for Samuel to know it's over for you? Or has God specifically told him? I don't know. But he knows. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and by implication, he's saying, Saul, it's not you. You're not a man after God's heart. And Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal. The rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army. Now look at the picture. What a phrase. Samuel leaves saddened because he knows what's going to happen. And for Samuel, something far worse than a military loss has just occurred. And he goes up one direction. He goes up from Gilgal, but the rest of the people go up after Saul to meet the army. They don't realize that a disaster has happened, and that is that Saul is really no longer going to have any moral authority to rule as king. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan his son and the people who were present with him stayed in Geba. But the Philistines encamped in Michmash, and raiders came out of the camp in 3 companies, and it tells where they go. And look at verse 19. There was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. So they wiped out anybody that set up a blacksmith shop, anybody that knew how to deal with iron. They must have just eliminated one way or another, because there are none, and it's clearly an intentional thing by the Philistines. But every one of the Israelites would go down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. It's sort of like getting all your computer chips from China, isn't it? I mean, it's just like, okay, there's going to come a point where that's not a good thing. I know I'm just a Baptist preacher, but that makes no sense to me. And here we are. That's exactly what they're doing. It's like, you've got to come to us. Oh, and while the relations are friendly, yeah, come to us for all your blacksmithing needs. Well, you know Philistine blacksmiths are the best in the world. Come here, we'll take care of you. And they do until they're at war. And now they've got nothing. They don't have the technical skill. They don't have the equipment, nothing. So on the day of the battle, in verse 22, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan. Just Saul and Jonathan, his son, had them. The king and the prince each have metal weapons. Everybody else has sticks and slings, and they're outclassed. And so, man, they're in trouble. Chapter 14 is about Jonathan winning a victory anyway. And the key that stands out, by the way, Jonathan is always portrayed as a man of character. There's no stain on Jonathan's character at all in here. He's not like his dad. When David comes into the picture, Jonathan, who is probably a much older man, and the heir apparent, nonetheless loves David, always sides with David. Jonathan wants to honor the Lord. Look at this. In verse 6 of chapter 14, Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." He's like, yeah, there's just 2 of us, but we can go up there and the Lord can give us a victory as easily as he could an army. It's up to him. It's the Lord's victory. And sure enough, the 2 of them they decide between themselves that if they come down to meet us, we'll deal with them one way. If they invite us to come up to them, we'll deal with them another. And sure enough, they invite him to come up. Jonathan and his sword bearer go up and apparently going to walk into an ambush, but it's only an ambush if you don't know it's coming. And Jonathan and his armor bearer wipe them out. I think killed 20 of them. And again, that causes panic. Every time there's a defeat, panic ensues. And verse 15, there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a great panic. So earthquakes are really common at this part of the world. Why? Why are earthquakes common here? Well, you've got two mega tectonic plates bumping up against each other right here. So the Dead Sea and Galilee, the Jordan River, if you look at a globe, you'll see that that's just a deep trench cut into the earth, goes all the way down into Africa in the Great Rift Valley. And Galilee is the northern end of the Great Rift Valley that goes all the way down into Africa. And these two continental plates are there, and it just takes, if there's a little pressure, these bumping up against each other, and some body of whatever is down there, and it gets squeezed, and up it pops, or this happens. These two plates squish up against each other, and they pop up. So earthquakes happen all the time, and that's why there's so many ruins. If it weren't for earthquakes, you wouldn't have nearly as many ruins to visit in Israel. So earthquakes happen all the time, and of course, sometimes they happen connected to nothing. Sometimes they happen at an opportune moment like this that just terrifies everybody. Look, the Lord has sent an earthquake, which no doubt he did. But I think there's an article in this month's National Geographic about, I think it's National Geographic, where they've recently discovered evidence of a biblical earthquake. It's mentioned in the Bible. I think in the beginning of the book of, I want to say Amos, an earthquake is mentioned, and they found, that layer, the evidence of it, but which would be hard to do just because there are so many earthquakes. They're just everywhere. When you go to Beth Shan, you can see where the columns used to stand, and it's just really ornate, but they're all laying over. And remember, those columns weren't monoliths. They weren't like one big column. They were drums to sit on top of each other to give the appearance of a column. So an earthquake comes, and it crumbles over, and you got it. So these big drums from different columns just sitting all over the place. Now, earthquakes are real common here, and the Lord gives one at a very opportune moment. And it says, verse 16, the watchman of Saul in Gibeah, Benjamin, looked, behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, count and see who's gone from us. And he sees, man, here's a bunch of Philistines running here and yon. And Saul knows somebody's done something, and he wants to figure it out, so they take a count of the troops. And two guys are missing, and it's Jonathan and his armor bearer. And Saul knows that it's Jonathan has done this. So Saul says to Ahijah, the priest, bring the ark of God here, for the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. Now, while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into battle. Behold, every Philistine sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. Now the Hebrews had been with the Philistines before that time, who had gone up with them into the camp. Even they also turned to be with the Israelites. Now there's an interesting detail. We're told that there were Israelites that had just taken up residence with the Philistines. So why does God spend so much time telling his people, when you go into the land, don't intermarry with them? You're to be a distinct people. You're to be different from them. And clearly you see here evidence that a lot of them went, I like the Philistine culture better. I like their gods better. I like their women better. And they just put in with them. This event, though, made even the Israelites that had done that say, I'm going back to the Jews. And they left the Philistines and went with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed hard after them in battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth Aven. And now you've got one other thing that sort of sets us up for where we're going in the life of David. So Saul, as they're fighting the Philistines, makes this rash vow. Have you ever made a rash vow? Have you ever made a stupid promise? I've done that before. And his rash vow is, if any of the men of Israel eat that day, they have to be put to death. And it's a dumb vow. Why would you make such a vow? First of all, not everybody can know you made the vow. Secondly, there's nothing morally significant about eating. And he said, nobody's going to eat till I'm avenged on my enemies. And none of them ate. And then Jonathan had not heard this. He'd not heard this instruction, and he's in the woods, sort of hiding out from the Philistines or looking for them, and he comes upon a honey tree. And, buddy, there is nothing that will give you an infusion of energy quite like honey. I mean, you can imagine if you're just spent and you find that honey and eat that, just immediately. I don't know if you guys have ever been, truly hungry. But I have. I know what it's like to go a long time without eating food. And the first time you put food in your mouth, your body feels it immediately. I don't mean 5 minutes later. I mean immediately. You're like, oh, that's a thing. You just feel it. It just changes your metabolism immediately. And Jonathan knows that, and Jonathan eats that. And as soon as he eats this honey, one of the people said, hey, your father strictly charged the people with an oath saying, cursed be the man who eats food this day. The people were faint. And Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey? How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found, for now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. He said, my dad did a dumb thing. He's made people suffer when God had given them victory, and if he'd let them eat and have of the spoils, they could wipe out the enemy. So they struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very faint. The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground. And the people ate them with the blood. Now, this is a huge thing. God commanded his people never, ever, ever, ever do that. The life is in the blood. And you think about how they have to always thoroughly cook their food. They cannot eat meat raw. Forgive me for being too plain, but this is just the law. The biblical ethic of frequent enjoyment of the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. What's the exception to that in the Old Testament? It's when she's on her period and there's blood involved. And why is that? Well, I think there are a lot of reasons, but one clear one is that the Canaanites around them, for them, blood becomes a part of the worship. For them, blood, and they believe that by eating something raw, they get the life force of that thing. And you find this in religions the world over. The Mayan culture, Incan culture did this. There are a lot of things by killing an enemy and then eating his flesh or his liver or his brain or whatever, you get his life force. God told his people, no, absolutely not. None of that. You can't eat anything raw. The life is in the blood. I want that life to be completely out of it. Why? Because God is the source of our life. And he does not want them thinking like the Canaanites. It's just that clear. And here you see Saul sets them up for failure. Now, I want to talk about this. Because who is responsible for their sin of them killing an animal and eating it raw? Well, they are. Because Saul exercised bad leadership doesn't give them an excuse to sin. But Saul is. Both things are true. Both things are true. And I think we need to learn this in marriage. We need to learn this in leadership. You often have the choice to make it easier or harder for someone else to be obedient to the Lord. Now, your sin is your sin, right? I don't care who sets you up for failure. You got to own your failure. And that's on you. But it's also true that if you're in a position of leadership or a particular role that God has assigned, and you fail in that position in such a way that it makes it easier for people who follow you to fall and to sin, their sin is their sin, but your sin is your sin, and you've sinned by making it easier on them to fail. And I think you see that here, both things. These people are not absolved of their responsibility. They clearly disobey the command of the Lord. Nobody forces them to do this. But Saul set them up so that it would sure be harder for them to be obedient and to wait to take the time to cook that food. And he did it for nothing. There's no purpose to this vow. There's no holiness implied. God didn't tell him to do it. And Jonathan knew that. And they told Saul, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood." And he said, "You've dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here." And Saul said, "Disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, let every man bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter them here and eat, and do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood." So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord, and it was the first altar that he built to the Lord. So Saul says, "Okay, I've messed up. The people messed up. Let's offer sacrifices to the Lord." But I would say there's a difference in repentance. I grieve over my sin, and fearing consequences. Oh no, God's going to punish us for sin. Both have their place, but repentance is by far superior. And you've got here now the continued, God still blesses. They defeat the Philistines. But then we come to chapter 15, and it's where the final rejection takes place, where the Lord tells Saul to destroy the Amalekites, Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and he says, "I want you to wipe them out completely, everything, man, woman, children, animals. I don't want you to keep anything." Now look, modern culture, people look at that and they just are put off by that. They say, how can God command them to do this? How can this be a holy thing? Well, I want you to see, first of all, two things. One is that God is the owner of all that is. His creation is his creation. And furthermore, what matters, eternity matters so much more. If God had left them alone and let them die in their old age, eternity's no better for them than them dying this way. So I would just say, never lose sight of the fact that the manner of death is not the worst thing that happens. Death itself, apart from God, is the worst thing that happens. And so God has the right to tell his people to destroy his enemies, and that's what he does here. But secondly, I want you to see that like at Jericho, God tells them they can't have any of the spoils of this war. Now, why does God do that? Because he doesn't want his people waging war for their own profit. It's not about them getting stuff. It's not about them getting rich. It's about his land being for his people. And they should have done this in a previous generation. They did not. God says, do it now. But look, this is all for me. Remember, he told the Israelites when they came into the promised land that they could not take one thing out of Jericho. And remember, Achan stole a change of clothes and some silver and buried it under his tent, and that's why they got defeated at Ai the first time. So God says, this is devoted to me. You don't get to take anything. I want you to destroy all of it. When Samuel shows up after the battle, now I want you to notice something here. Verse 2 of chapter 15, verse 1 says, now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Literally, that says, listen to the voice of the Lord. And the voice of the Lord tells him, kill both man, woman, child, infant, ox, sheep, camel, and oxen. And we're told in verse 9, Saul and the people spared Agag, the best of the sheep and of the oxen and the fattened calves. When Samuel comes there to the scene, verse 13, Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Now, Saul just lies. He said, I did what God said. And Samuel said, what then is this? I want you to catch something. Here's where a translation, all these translations, and the ESV is a great translation, but they claim to be word for word. There's no such thing. There's no such thing. Languages don't have a word for word relationship. One word might have 30 different ways to translate it in another language. And they're not wrong here when they say, what is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? Because in our language, what do sheep do? They bleat. And what do cows do? They low or they moo. But guess what the word is in Hebrew? It's the word for voice. Right? The voice of the Lord came to you and told you what to do. What does the voice of the sheep mean and the voice of the oxen? In other words, hey, Saul, whose voice did you listen to? You're listening to the wrong voice. Down in verse 20, Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I've gone on mission on which the Lord sent me. I've brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I've devoted the Amalekites to destruction. Now, look at verse 22. Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Down in verse 24, Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Here's the question of this chapter. Whose voice are you listening to? And Saul is not listening to the voice of the Lord, so the Lord is going to raise up a king who's going to listen to his voice. And to put an exclamation mark on that, Samuel then did what Saul had been commanded to do. He took Agag, the king, and he cut him up, killed him in Gilgal. And look at verse 35. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. But Samuel grieved over Saul. And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Both God and God's man grieving over God's anointed king. What a picture, but what a setup for the coming king. And again, what a gospel picture. God's people throughout the ages have been a major disappointment. And it took a coming king who would perfectly listen to the voice of God to redeem his people.